Welcome to the Community Church of Chapel Hill, Unitarian Universalist. I'm Kathy Putnam, and I'm a member of the worship ministry here at the church. I especially want to welcome any guests and newcomers. And if you are a visitor this morning, there's a special note for you. Welcome guests and newcomers on the back side of your service. One of our visitors today is Maxine Okazaki, and she is the artist whose photographs are gracing our sanctuary. Do you want to stand? Maxine's She's a member of ERUF, the Eno River UU Fellowship, and she's had a lifelong interest in photography and nature as expressed in birds. After a career as a scientist at Duke University Medical Center and a consultant, she rekindled these interests, and we're privileged to have this exhibit of your art. Thank you. As we continue with reopening, I want to mention a few things to keep in mind. We're masking inside on Sunday mornings as a way of striving to be an inclusive community. And today, the virtual coffee hour is on Zoom at 11:30 and will be hosted by Rachel Brooks. We're now currently passing offering baskets, so if you want to make a donation or donate to today's Share the Plate, which you'll hear about, there are baskets as you enter or exit the sanctuary. Now please turn off or silence any cell phones during our service to maintain a worshipful experience. And Jane Provan will now tell us about today's Share the Plate for Charles House.
Good morning. I'm one of the co-chairs for the Share the Plate Committee along with Jill Baker. And I'm representing our Charles House volunteers from the church, Eric Leith, who could not be here today, and Sue Brewer, who has given a lot of her time over the years to Charles House. And my husband, Scott, and I do music from time to time at Charles House. So we are volunteers there, so I'm pretty passionate about this group. Today's collection will go to the Scholarship Fund at the Charles House Center for Community Elder Care. This exceptional day program was started by the family of our first minister, Charlie Jones, over 30 years ago, and has been supported generously by volunteers and donations from the community church ever since. In recognition of the many years of support from this church, Charles House is going to be dedicating a beautiful new piano at the center to the community church. Over the years, Charles House has remained true to its original ideas, which are to treat older people with respect while allowing them to safely do all they are capable of doing. There are varied activities, including lots of music and dancing, a delicious lunch, flexible schedules, and a very dedicated staff in a safe and stimulating place. This allows families to work and fulfill other obligations. Beyond care for elders, however, Charles House also provides other services to the community, such as support groups for family caregivers and training for student interns. Furthermore, the staff welcomes elder care professions from other programs to share methods that make Charles House one of the leading facilities for elder care in this area. Thank you so much for your past and present donations. They offer attendance to people who would not otherwise be able to spend fun and rewarding days at Charles House. Please place your donations in the baskets at the back of the sanctuary. All cash today and checks will go to the Share the Plate for Charles House. Make your checks out to the church, but in the memo line, please note STP for Share the Plate and Charles House so we know which organization it goes to. You can also donate online for those of you who are watching virtually or live today. You go to our online donation site, you find the Share the Plate place on there, and you have to say Charles House to make sure that it goes to Charles House. Do it now while you're thinking about it so you don't forget. We sure appreciate your help. Thank you so much.
Please rise as you are able and sing today's opening hymn, number 21, For the Beauty of the Earth. As we leave behind the busyness of our lives and enter into this time together, I invite you to listen to these words from Wendell Berry. When despair in the world grows in me, and I wake at the night at the least sound, in fear of what my life and my children's lives may be, I go and lie down where the wood drake rests, in his beauty on the water, and the great heron feeds. I come into the peace of wild things, who do not tax their lives with forethought of grief. I come into the presence of still waters, and I feel above me the day-blind stars waiting for their light. For a time, I rest in the grace of the world and am free. Come, let us worship together. You'll find the words for our chalice lighting in your order of service, and if you wish to do so, please join me in reading them. We affirm that every one of us is held in creation's hand, a part of the interdependent cosmic web, and hence strangers need not be enemies, that no one is saved until all are saved, where all means the whole of creation.
Each week, we hold in our service a time for sharing the joys and the sorrows that we bring with us into this church community. It's at this time that we invite you, if you've come with either a significant personal joy or a significant personal sorrow, you're invited to come forward, and to come forward either down one of the two sides. When it is your turn to come forward, speak into the microphone, share your name, place a stone in the water, and briefly share your joy or your sorrow. Let us enter into this time of tenderness and into this time of trust.
Good morning, my name is Eric Bannon. I have a joy and a sorrow. This morning, my sorrow, a friend of mine, a great musician from Asheville, upright bass player by the name of Elliot Wyopian, died suddenly Monday morning of a heart attack. He was actually scheduled to play on a recording session with me next week. So, I'm not sure what we're going to do about that. My joy is last night I played my first songwriter gig live in over a year. It was outdoors at the Bun Front Porch. We had 100 people, and it was around, and we literally had them dancing in the street. Thank you.
I'm Susan Blanchard, and I too have a sorrow and a joy. The sorrow, the first stone, was placed for my cousin Bob, who died in February of COVID and heart disease. He lived in Long Island and had not been able to get vaccinated, and we weren't meeting in February, so I didn't get to place a stone then. He would have been 73 this summer. The joy I have is that I did get fully vaccinated, and I am here to report that I turned 75 this week.
I have two stones. First, my name is Paige Smith, and pre-pandemic, my daughter Nora was sort of living and working overseas, and during the pandemic, she took a job at UU Church in Hendersonville, and because everybody was online, we got to spend a lot of time together. Well, all that came to an end on Wednesday. We put her on a plane to Spain, where she's starting her next adventure overseas, teaching in the school system there. So it's going to be a really long time before I see her. Although I'll get to go to Spain, hopefully next year. So my second stone is that going to Merlefest would have been a great way to recover, but unfortunately didn't get to go again this year.
I'm Don Katahdin. I was a member here from 2009 to 2012, and I have a joy. My 19-year-old son Arthur just got accepted to the University of Oregon track team. He does a decathlon.
My name is Susan Spalt, and my first stone is for our niece Becca, who is having deep brain stimulation surgery this week, the first of 2 that she will have for early onset Parkinson's. So we ask you to keep Becca and her daughter Susie in your hearts this week. The second stone is for our good friend Jim, who is battling myeloid leukemia and who has been battling an infection over the last this week and is really having a rough time right now. So please hold him in your hearts as well. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Sarah. I have 2 sort of sorrows. Well, definitely one. One of my best friend's dad's in the hospital, so I'm placing a Sten for him. He's recovering, but it's slow and scary. And then the other thing I just felt, called to share that a sorrow is parenting during the pandemic. It's just hard and it's lonely and it's scary and it's a lot of like mental gymnastics. And I have a child that has some special needs that we're working out. So it's just been particularly exhausting. So if y'all could hold us in love, that would be helpful. Thank you.
My name is Celeste Kurz. I have a joy filled with gratitude for my late grandfather. I grew up pretty poor with a single mom, and I had never before lived in anything other than an apartment and never had a yard. And last week we closed on a house at the end of this road that has a big yard, and I'm making a garden for Papa. So thank you, Papa, for making it happen.
Hi, I'm Bruce Caden, and my son Jonah, who's all the way off at college at UNC over here, and is back here helping in RE, turns 18 today. So please find him during the after service and surprise him with a happy birthday.
First stone is a stone of joy. Yesterday I was fortunate and blessed to be able to officiate at the wedding of church member Glenn Davis to Margaret McGuinn. And I think they're at brunch right now. But they left some of their beautiful flowers from their wedding, and it was a joyful day. The second stone I placed is, as I place each week, is for all those joys and sorrows that we hold in our hearts that were not spoken. Won't you join with me in the spirit of prayer and meditation? In the opening words that Kathy chose for this morning, she evoked that sense of despair for the world and responding by going to that still and wild place where the wood drake and the wild heron feed. Perfect words on this morning in which we are surrounded. I don't see any wood drakes, but I do see a few herons looking in on us. Amidst the joys and the sorrows of our lives, amidst the losses of friends, amidst our care for family members facing illness, amidst our joys for children and young people in our life, finding themselves amidst the pressures of our days and the blessings as well. Let us take a moment to reconnect with this beautiful and bountiful and hurting and imperiled world. Let us connect with the air we breathe, with the trees that shade us, with all living things. With the ground of our being, the ground of this treasured earth. I invite us to hold before us a few moments of silence. Let us be still together. And I am thine, I rest in thee, great Spirit, come and rest in me. Our meditation hymn this morning is number 16, and I invite us to remain seated as we sing together. 15.
The reading for today is by Sean Parker Dennison, How to Survive the Apocalypse. First, learn to listen, not only for enemies, around corners in hidden places, but for the faint footsteps of hope and the whisper of resistance. Hone your skills, aim your heart toward kindness, and stockpile second chances. Under the weight of destruction, we will need the strong shelter of forgiveness and the deeper wells that give the sweet water of welcome. We have a place for you. When the world ends, we must not add destruction to destruction, not accept a beggar's bargain to fight death with more death. In order to survive the apocalypse, any apocalypse at all, we have to give up the counterfeit currency of self-sufficiency, the mistaken addiction to competition, the lie that the last to die has somehow survived.
While the choir's coming up, I wanted to tell you a little bit about this piece we're going to sing. This is some words from the arranger. I heard a village in Haiti sing Freo and was overcome with the power of the expression of grief. As a man lies dying from illness, his relatives appeal to the voodoo spirits Thom Belote, the serpent, and Aida, the rainbow. These married spirits are very old images brought from West Africa to Haiti to symbolize our connection to the past, the present, and the future, which we feel more strongly in the face of impending death. And these are the lyrics to the song. The words they're singing are Haitian, and this is a translation. Oh brother, you tell us your sickness will not be healed. We are playing the drums and singing and weeping. You are sick, I will tell the others. We are playing the drums and singing to Papa Dambala. We are asking Papa Dambala to look after us. We all sing to Aida Wedo, see your children. So this is to be sung, written to be sung to a man, but I thought it would be sung to the earth. Well, thanks, Eric, Ben, for helping us out on the Cajon today.
Bye.
So back on August 8th, I was scheduled to deliver a sermon titled Transforming Grief. The sermon that I wrote was about how grief is a universal part of the human experience, and it was about how grief, rather than being something that we battle or something that we avoid, how grief can actually be something that transforms our lives, helping us to live more courageously and purposefully. And you may know the story. I woke up on Sunday, August 8th, ready to come to church, but with a cough and a wheeze. And I figured that the responsible thing to do would be to call in sick and go get a COVID test. So I sent Larry Ross, the worship associate that Sunday, an assortment of readings on grief to give instead of my sermon. And I went off to the urgent care to get a COVID test, which turned out negative. You may be interested to know that for the past 6 Sundays, I've actually been getting a COVID test weekly, each Thursday or Friday, for my own peace of mind. It is my way of finding a path between denial and constant anxiety. So anyways, that sermon that I had written on transforming grief for August 8th, and it was truly a brilliant sermon, by the way, talked about how, in addition to all the types of personal grief that we may experience in our lives, on top of the deaths of loved ones, in addition to illnesses and sufferings and disappointments, that there are on top of those at least three types of collective grief that I think are afflicting us in these times. One of those is pandemic grief, grief for all of the difficulties of living in this pandemic. Second of all, political grief, grief at the dysfunction of our political system. And third of all, I named ecological or environmental grief. Grief for the present and future losses in the natural world and in our lives due to global climate change. This morning, I'm not going to deliver that sermon I'd written for August 8th, but instead I want to dive more deeply into a part of that sermon that I only touched on briefly. I want to talk about what may be called ecological grief or environmental grief or climate grief, or I've heard it called eco-grief. It means what it sounds like. It is our human response, our grief response, that response of profound sadness and profound loss to the reality of human-driven climate change and global warming, and all of the suffering and destruction that this catastrophe is yielding now and will cause in the future. If climate change is the most pressing issue of our times, and I think that it's probably right to say that it is, then figuring out how to live with this reality of climate grief may be the greatest spiritual question of our times. So I'll ask, am I off base here? How many of you have experienced what you may call climate grief in your life? Is that something? Many of you. And so my sermon this morning is about what we might do with that. If you came looking for a sermon on environmental policy, that's not what I've written. There's probably better people to listen to than that. But I do want to talk about this reality. The world has entered a time of crisis marked by global warming, extreme weather, heat waves, fires, droughts, and storms. according to all of the scientific models, these extremes will only increase and become more pressing over the coming years and decades. If we changed course today, if nations the world over collectively made radical changes to the way human life is lived, we might be able to avoid some of the worst of this, though we would still face catastrophic challenges. Unfortunately and depressingly, there is a lack of political will for climate urgency. The political choices we seem to have are between insufficient incremental change and pure denial. One political choice is better than the other, but neither is sufficient for these days. So what do we do? What do we do with climate grief? With climate grief, the image that comes to mind is an image from Greek mythology. In the story from Greek mythology, the hero Odysseus has to steer his ship between two fearsome and irresistible monsters by the names Scylla and Charybdis. Scylla and Charybdis. And Odysseus has to steer his ship between these two fearsome creatures, not getting too close to either, to move forward. And I feel like in my own grief, it's necessary to navigate between two polar extremes. One polar extreme is just abject despair, a hopelessness that paralyzes and immobilizes. And the other extreme is denial, or avoidance, or sticking my head in the sand and pretending that nothing is the matter. That neither of these choices, neither of these monsters are spiritually fulfilling, but it's necessary to chart a course between them. And there is, I think, a way to guide ourselves between these polar extremes of hopelessness and escapism, between the monsters of despair and emotional and spiritual bypassing. And so what I would like to do is to name a couple of different resources provided by courageous guides who I think provide a way of steering between these dangerous ways of approaching grief. And I would say that this works for eco-grief, but it also works for other forms of grief as well. Where there is one temptation is to go to the place of just total despair, and the other is to avoid and deny. The first courageous guide is someone named Joanna Macy, who I know a number of you are familiar with. She is an environmental activist and student of Buddhism. She is, I understand, 92 years old and still going strong. In fact, she had a book that came out last year. Her work is centered on moving us from despair to creative and powerful engagement with the world. Her titles include Despair and Personal Power in the Nuclear Age, and Active Hope and How to Face the Mess We're In Without Going Crazy. More recently, she refers to her work as the work of reconnection. She says that both despair and denial are two forms of disconnection, and so we need to respond with reconnection. Joanna Macy proposes 4 steps. First, beginning with gratitude. Gratitude, she says, gratitude for the natural world quiets the frantic mind, stimulates our empathy and our confidence. Gratitude allows us to be fully present, opening the emotional space for acknowledging the pain we are carrying for our world. After gratitude, there is the second move, which is towards compassion. When we dare to experience this pain for the world, we learn the meaning of compassion, she writes. What has isolated us in private anguish now opens ourselves to each other and to all of existence. Macy's third step involves seeing with new and ancient eyes. She writes that once we grasp the reality of our interexistence, we can feel how intimately and inextricably linked we are related to all that is. We grow to feel the texture of our living connections with the past and the future and with all beings. And finally, Joanna Macy's fourth step involves going forth and acting according to our situation, our gifts, as well as our limitations. We act with others whenever and wherever possible, but do not wait for a perfect blueprint or a foolproof scheme. Even when we do not succeed, she writes, we move forward in learning and in gratitude. And in that return to gratitude, we start that cycle over again. Another resource for working through climate grief that I was turned on to is something called the Good Grief Network. The Good Grief Network, which focuses on environmental grief or eco-grief. The goal of this is to help individuals and communities build resilience by creating spaces where people can lean into their painful feelings about the state of the world and reorient their lives toward meaningful action. The Good Grief Network uses the sort of the format of grief support groups and 12-step programs as their model to help people develop skills for transforming environmental grief into more courageous and grounded living. Isn't that fascinating? And I want to mention just one more person who has written a bit on the subject of eco-grief. And my thanks goes to my wife Ann Belote for recommending this to me. In Friday's New York Times, there was a piece written by Tressie McMillan Cottom. Professor Cottom is a MacArthur Fellow and is also a professor here at UNC Chapel Hill. Her piece is entitled, "The Disaster We Must Think About Every Day," and it details how she has moved into living with greater purpose and greater consciousness due to ecological grief. She begins her piece in the New York Times by talking about how the effects of global climate change are first and most acutely felt by people of color, whether in Bangladesh or New Orleans or eastern North Carolina or in the urban heat deserts of Atlanta and Raleigh and Durham and Charlotte. People of color suffer disproportionately from global warming. Professor Cottom's piece, though, is really about how to live in the midst of this grief and the midst of this destruction. She writes about how to find a practice that isn't grounded in distancing and avoidance, but also does not result in being completely overwhelmed. And again and again and again, the people who I've found who write on this topic write about that need to steer that middle path between avoidance and denial and overwhelm and just being despair. Professor Cottom writes as the way through that is to choose one thing to do to combat climate change. As silly as that sounds, because you think, what would one thing do? And she says the important thing is to find that one thing and to really go for it, whether that's putting solar panels on your house or going vegetarian or switching to an electric car or composting or fighting at the local level for environmentally sustainable decisions. Says it doesn't matter what it is, it just matters that you do it and that it becomes your one thing. And then she writes there is this change that happens when you bring climate change into your everyday practice, when you put these symbols of climate change in your view. It becomes a tactical reminder, a constant reminder that this thing is happening and happening right now. And the second part is that by keeping it in your consciousness, you are more likely to live in such a way that puts it in other people's consciousness and reminds us to make demands demands of the larger political and corporate world. Professor Putnam writes, shifting our awareness to making demands of politicians and corporations for doing their outside share starts by putting the little symbols of climate in our daily view. What if we saw grief as not something to be avoided, to escape from, nor as something that completely envelops us, leaving us powerless and despairing? What if we saw a middle way through, transformed grief into action, into courageous living? Amen. Blessed be. And our closing hymn this morning is one of action that I invite you to sing out as you go forth. It is one of our favorites, Blue Boat Home. And I invite you to rise in body or in spirit and to join with me in singing.
I want us to thank our musicians because they've all been wonderful. And just a quick reminder that you may make your donations in those baskets on your way out of the sanctuary. The words to extinguish the chalice are in your order of service. Please join me if you wish to do so. We extinguish this flame, not the light of truth, the warmth of community, or the fire of commitment. These we carry in our hearts until we are together again. And either join hands or go like this to sing Shalom.